Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as of right now, I'll be going over Chapter 12 of Tony Gaddis's Starting Out with Java Early Objects, 5th edition. Again, Chapter 12 is going to continue our look into graphical user applications in Java, and it's going to talk about most of the stuff we missed in the first part, such as read-only text fields, lists, combo boxes, displaying images and labels and buttons, mnemonics and tooltips, file choosers and color choosers, how to create menus, text areas and fonts, sliders, and we end up talking about look and feel. Read-only text fields, as it says, they're a different way to use the J text field component. The idea with a read-only, it's very similar to, basically it's the same thing as the read-only that we've done in other languages like C#. With almost any type of UI component, really just about any type I can think of, will have a set editable property. And by default, that's set to true in virtually all controls. But if you set it to false, you're making that control read-only. All right. Talking about lists, as mentioned there, a list is a component that displays a list of names. It's like a list box, really, in other languages. It's called a JList component in here. And notice, as an example, we come in here and we create a string array. We put, looks like 7 names in there: Bill, Jerry, Greg, Jean, Kirk, Philip, and Susan. And then we create a new JList based off of or filled with those names. When you set up a JList, I believe that the default is single selection mode, which means you can only select one at a time. You can set it up for single interval selection mode, where you can select multiple, but they must all connect. They must be contiguous items. Or you can have multiple interval selection mode, where you can select multiple items and they don't have to be contiguous. Oh, it says there that's the default, so I'm wrong. That's the default selection mode. Now, this is something you'd use for a lot of different things. You could have a drop-down list for states, for example, and then you probably would only want it in single selection mode. Here's that same list of names that we saw before, and there's single selection, where we can only select one name at a time. There's single interval, where we can select multiple, but they must be contiguous. And there's multiple interval, all right, where you can select multiple and there are no restrictions, as it says. You change that selection mode type using the set selection mode, and those are the three. Again, hopefully you realize by now we've seen this in other contexts, and these are, after the dot in all three cases, these are constants. List events, as it says, it generates a list selection event, which is handled by the list selection listener class, so you must implement the list selection listener interface, and you have a value changed event. When the list component generates an event, so in other words, if you click on anything in the list, it automatically executes the value changed method. It passes the event object and it does whatever you tell it to do. Now, the key thing here is when you look, you can either select the value or you can select the index. And again, it's computers, so if the first element is selected, get selected index will be set to 0. If nothing is selected, get selected index will be set to -1. All right, sometimes you want to know what the value is. Sometimes you want to know where the value is. As it says, get selected value returns a reference, so it's mandatory that you cast that to a string if you want to be able to use it. And if no item is selected and you choose get selected value, it returns null. As mentioned previously with the get selected index, returns the index of the selected item, or -1 if nothing is selected. So it's called an index because each item in the index, so each item that's in this list, this would be index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, index 4, index 5, and index 6. So they show you an example here. As it says, this code could be used to determine whatever item was selected, for example. You can decide, if you want to, you can set borders around lists. So notice the colors that you can use are any of the 13 built-in colors, and this is the number of pixels, I believe, that wide that you want the border to be. Goes back to that border factory, and we mentioned that in the last chapter. By default, as it says, the list component is large enough to display all of the items it contains. But, for example, if it was all 50 states, you wouldn't be able to show them all at once. Most GUI applications display a scroll bar if you've got too many, but by default, the list component does not display the scroll bar. If you want to display it, first you set the number of items you want to be visible at any one time. Then you create a scroll pane object, and you add that scroll pane object to the container. So this is all stuff we've seen before. Okay. We figure out how many rows we want to show. We create the scroll pane object as is shown right here. And then we add it to the panel. So, as mentioned here, when the list component displays, it appears with 3 items showing at a time and with scroll bars automatically. Notice by default, it only displays a scroll bar if there's if there are more items in the list than there are room to show them. When you add the list component to the scroll pane object, the border will automatically appear around the list, and as always, there are examples of this in the text. If you want to add items to an existing list, because it is possible for lists to grow and shrink. So if you had a list of people in a club, for example, you might get new club members, existing club members might drop out, etc. So with the set list data, as it says, it replaces any items currently displayed in the list. You use that to add items to an empty list. You can create an empty list just by doing this. So here we're creating it, and here we're adding all the items to it at once. So again, as mentioned right here, if you want a single selection interval, that's what you pass. I think everybody knows what an interval is. I don't think we have to really go through it. All right, so you click on the first item you're interested in, hold down on the shift key, and click on the last one. If it's single interval selection, again, those must be contiguous. And if it's multiple, they don't have to be. The getSelectedValue method, as mentioned, returns the first item. Okay. The getSelectedIndex method returns the index of the first item. If you want the entire selected interval, instead of getSelectedValue singular, you use getSelectedValues plural. Now you might want to do that. Again, if you wanted to find out, for instance, if you were going through a list of customers and you wanted to find out which of them maybe were behind in payments. The getSelectedIndices as opposed to getSelectedIndex, the indices returns an array of int values that are the indices of all the items that were selected in the list. Again, when they're multiple, they don't have to be contiguous. You can still select a single item if you want, or you can select any interval of items. With multiple, unlike the single where you use the shift key, with multiple you use the control key. And that allows you to select an item and you don't have to deselect the other items. Again, notice it works the same way. getSelectedValue returns the first selected item. getSelectedValues returns an array containing the items. getSelectedIndex returns the index of the first selected item. getSelectedIndices returns an int array with all of the indexes. All right, and the author does, I think, a nice job in here of giving examples that you could use. A combo box, as it says, it's a drop-down list that the user may select from. Combo box, I guess, would probably be something you'd use more for states. But you pass an array of objects to be displayed, so he's doing it the same way here. The difference is last time it was a list where you could show multiple, and here it's the combo box where you only show one at a time. When you click the down arrow, it shows as many as it can possibly show. Notice here that when an item in a combo box is selected, it generates an action event. You've heard this before with buttons and radio buttons. So you must have the action event listener must be implemented, and you must have an action performed method. When the user selects an item in the combo box, it automatically is going to execute the action perform method. They should look familiar by now. Again, there's the get selected item, there's the get selected index, and as always, the first index will be 0, so the first item that's in there will be item 0. And here's an example. All right. I believe, well, let's just go on. Retrieving selected items, here are some examples. All right. There's two types of combo boxes. Notice there's an uneditable one, which allows you only to select items from a list, and an editable one. The difference is with the editable one, as it says, it's a combination of a text field and a list, so you can select items from the list, but you can also enter a new value into the text field and have it go into the list. So an editable combo box is a text field with a small button displaying an arrow joining it. So the user may either select an existing item or type their own item in. Now, sometimes that would make sense. You notice in here, as an example, as they say, Sharon is not in the list. So you type in Sharon and boom. All right, that could be the selection you make. Now, sometimes that will make sense, but for example, with a thing of states, if you listed all 50 states, you probably wouldn't want to set it up so it was an editable combo box. All right. You can display images in labels and in buttons, kind of like you do in HTML. So a label can display text, an image, or both a text and an image. If you want to display an image, you create an instance of the image icon class. Notice the supported file types. That's good because that handles probably just about everything that you would think of. JPEG, GIF, and PNG. You either have to have it in the same, it depends on the editor you're using, but quite often you're going to end up putting paths in there. Be real leery about putting full paths into places as opposed to relative paths. So when you put full path names in, when you put in full path names, the biggest problem that you're going to run into with a full path name is if you move what you're working on from one machine to the other. So what if I move from one machine to the other and my home drive was not my C drive, for example? As it says, you display the image in a label by passing the image icon object. So again, here's an example where we're going to have a smiley GIF and we're going to have the label saying have a nice day with the image after it, so they will both be in there. Creating a button is done pretty much the same way. All right, the image, then you create the button, and you tag them both or you add them both on. As it says, and notice, for whatever reason, Gaddis put this in bold and bigger letters. You're not limited to small graphical icons when placing images and labels and buttons. All right, and they show an example. All right. I think everybody understands mnemonics. As it says, it's a key that you press in combination with the Alt key to access a component, sometimes referred to as jump keys or hotkeys. For instance, for years when you were working in any Microsoft product, when you did an Alt-X, it would bring up an exit menu type of thing. The argument that gets passed to the method is some kind of an integer code. So These are predefined as mentioned in the java.awt.event package, and they look pretty ugly. So for instance, if I wanted to assign Alt-A, I do a key event.vk, which stands for virtual key A. So here's setting exit, very similar to what I just mentioned to you previously. Notice if the first letter in that is in that component's text, or if the letter is in there, like exit, that'll be underlined. If it does not appear, there is no underline. So if I said exit in the previous example, it would say EXIT, but that X that you see right there would be underlined. You can assign mnemonics to radio buttons, and you can assign them to checkboxes. So for this, if I wanted to choose breakfast, I could either click that radio button or do an Alt-B, lunch, or an Alt-L, etc. Tooltips. I think we all know what tooltips are. As it says, they're displayed in the toolbox when the mouse, or small box when the mouse is hovered over them. Typically, it gives a short description of what a component does. Just be real leery. I mean, that's kind of a dumb example. Exit. Click here to exit. I understand why the author put that in there, but yet that's probably not something you'd actually use. Kind of a rule of thumb or a litmus test for this is if you say, well, gee, would a user maybe not know what something means, then maybe it needs a tooltip. But be very leery of overusing tooltips, all right? Because it is, as mentioned, it's very easy to overuse and abuse them, okay? All right, a file chooser is a dialog box that when you click it, it brings up files. So if you want to be able to add a file to a program, and there are two constructors. The first one takes no arguments, so it uses the default directory, so that's what it'll show. The second one is a string argument, so you can put in a path. Maybe there's another directory that you want to look through, or you want to go up to the root, or whatever. The file chooser, as it says, can display either an open file dialog box or a save file dialog box. Those are pretty standard. For the open file, you do the show open dialog. For the save, you do the show save dialog. You'll notice that they're set up the same. The argument can be null or a reference to a component in both cases. All right, if null is pressed, the dialog box is centered on the screen. If you pass a reference, it's displayed over the component. All right. Both methods, as mentioned, return an integer that indicates the action the user took. You can compare that value so you can see if did they choose nothing. All right, did they click an OK button, or did some kind of an error occur? If the user selects a file, you can use the getSelectedFile method to determine the file that was selected. You can use the getPath if you want more information about it. All right, there's also a color chooser. Again, this is pretty standard. C# has the same kind of file chooser, color chooser, open file dialog, etc. So the color chooser brings up the specialized color palette. As mentioned here, by clicking the HSB tab, that's right there, RGB and HSB. RGB is red, green, blue. HSB, I'm not sure if the B is blue, but the H and S are hue and saturation. Swatches will show something like this. Oh, that's it. Hue, saturation, and brightness. And that's red, green, blue. That makes sense. All right. The color chooser has a static method named showDialog, which is used to bring it up. Again, if the first thing that's in here for the parent is null, it's automatically centered. If it's a reference to a component, the dialog box displays over that component. The next argument is the dialog title. The final argument in here indicates the color that initially appears in the dialog box. So if you were going to set up something where you wanted all of your fields to, let's say, be red, maybe we're going to use some kind of an error condition. All right. Here's an example where they use blue. I've noticed that there are very few, here's an example, but by and large, there are very few graphics in most of these chapters. Or maybe he's just trying to keep the size of each one of these PowerPoint files down. All right? But here is one of those cases where he has a graphic, because he's showing here all of the major components of a menu. All right? And again, as you can see, the menu bar is this. The menu itself is this, and it's this. The separator is a line between different types of options. You can have a checkbox menu where whatever you've chosen is checked. You can have a radio button menu where here we could have large font or small font, but not both. A menu underneath the menu is a submenu. So it says a menu system is a collection of commands organized in one or more drop-down menus. Here's those components. I'm not going to read them to you, but I will leave those up there for just a second so you can take a look. Now, it depends on the package that you choose as far as creating this. One thing that I may or may not have made evident in this lecture, normally when you create all this stuff in a language like C#, it's drag and drop. Depending on the editor that you're using, you've got your choice in Java. You can either make it drag and drop, which is fine, but if you don't want it to be drag and drop, all right, if you don't want it to be that way, you can also key in your code to do it also. And you can actually do that in C#. You can write all your components by using code. It's just it's very rarely done. It's much easier to drag and drop. So as it says, the menu system is constructed using all of the classes that are shown there. And they pretty much correspond to what you saw right here. And here is an explanation of each one of those. Again, it's not my intention here to sit and read PowerPoints to you. Granted, we're going over the PowerPoints, but I'm not going to sit and read those, okay? There is an example program. In fact, there's at least one in here, all right? Okay. The text field class is used to create text fields. We already talked about what a text field is. The big thing about a text field is it's a single line of text. So if you want multiple lines, so if you had a form that you were creating and it had something like comments where you wanted to allow people to write multiple lines, the text field isn't going to cut it. In that case, you're going to use a text area. All right, and as mentioned, the general format is shown here. So you can set up just the rows and columns, very similar to the way you set up a text area in HTML. Or you can put some text in there and have your rows and columns. What you're going to notice when you use a lot of this stuff, when we start going over examples, is that if you want to fill up a text field or a text area with text, you use the setText method. If you want to grab what currently exists in a text field or a text area, you use the getText method. Like what we've looked at earlier with the list bars, we don't commonly have scroll bars, so you have to add them. They're added very much in the same way that we looked at before. All right? So when you create the scroll bars, automatically a vertical and a horizontal will be displayed. Sometimes you need one but not the other, so you can alter it by only putting in the one that you need. So this would never put in a horizontal, this would always put in a vertical, etc. All right? And they talk about that as it says, you can pass one or more of the following constants as an argument. Sometimes putting a scroll bar can, for lack of better words, can look kind of unprofessional. That's why sometimes at least people do not do it. All right, look and notice here, by default, the text area components do not perform line wrapping. So in other words, you can just keep typing until you hit the enter key. But you can set the line wrap to true as shown right there. And you can set it up so that the lines are broken between characters, which is the default mode, and word wrapping, whereas it says the line breaks always occur between words. So with character wrapping, it's probably more likely to look like it's justified, where with word wrapping, it's going to look more, I don't even know what, staggered, for lack of better words. You can set up fonts in Java. All right. Font, as it says, is the name of a typeface, which you can set up, and you can make it by default be plain, bold, and italic, or bold, plain. And if it's plain, it can't be bold or italic. But if it's not plain, it can be bold, it can be italic, or it can be bold and italic. You can set a default font size, which is set in points. There's a set fonts, which changes the appearance. So why would you do this? All right. You would do this if you had a desire, maybe you didn't like the default font that came with the system, you thought it looked unprofessional or whatever. All right. As mentioned, Java guarantees that you'll have the fonts that are shown there. You can try other fonts. Okay. I have never tried this, but I know that Google Fonts offers thousands of fonts. And I don't see any reason why you probably could not add Google Fonts to a Java program, and there's probably a really good website out there. I just have never checked it out. Again, plain, bold, and italic. So here's setting a font for this label. It'll be a serif font that's bold and 24 points. Sliders are kind of neat. They can be either horizontal or vertical. All right. We may end up, or I may end up going through an example with you later on in the book that goes through a slider. Okay. You can set up what your minimum and maximum are. These little things that are in here are called ticks. You can decide not only where this slider knob is and what your minimum and maximum are, but what each tick value is worth. So as mentioned, a slider can be used to kind of visually show a range of numeric values. Between these major tick marks, like every 10, are minor tick marks. So notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So that'd be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 4, etc. You get the idea. The slider constructor, as it says, the first thing in there is orientation, which can be horizontal or vertical. You set the minimum, you set the maximum. I believe if you don't set a minimum and maximum, and I could always be wrong here, but I believe that by default, it'll set it up to 0 and 100 for you. All right. Here's where you set the tick spacing. So the one that we saw had minor tick spacing set to 2. There's how you display the tick marks. Again, it's like anything else in here. This isn't going to make a lot of sense until you sit down, write yourself a program, and throw a bunch of these controls in there. All right? When you use graphical editors, typically, again, that you have the ability to drag and drop this stuff, so it doesn't become important. That is as important. It's more important when you come in and you're writing code to create the interface yourself. Notice when the knob position or when that slider's position is moved, it generates a change event. So you need to write a change listener class. So you must implement the change listener interface, which must have a method named stateChanged. You want the current value of the slider. All right, and there's an example of temp converter. All right, so morning. Again, the appearance, as it says here, of a system's GUI is known as its look and feel. Java's default look and feel is called metal, but there are some that they're going to show here, such as Motif in Windows. Motif is more Unix looking. Windows is more the Unix look. Again, they don't show it in here. There it is. So there's metal Motif in Windows. It is actually possible, or at least it used to be, and I don't see why it still wouldn't be, it was possible for you to go out and buy motifs that were over and above the ones that were there. All right. So to change the look and feel, again, as it says, you call the user interface manager's set look and feel method. All right. It takes a fully qualified class name. So here it is. Metal look and feel, Motif look and feel, Windows look and feel. Any components that were already on the interface need to be updated. So as it says, you want to call the update component tree. There are different exceptions that can be thrown, so maybe you spelled something wrong, or maybe you put in a motif that for whatever reason isn't available on the system you're using. So typically you put this in a try-catch block because, again, when you try setting it up, it can potentially fail. And I guess that's it. So we've gone through the first 12 chapters. I'm going to do these a little bit out of order, so I'm going to come back in just a minute, and I'm actually going to do next chapter 15, which is on recursion because it's a short chapter. All right, so when I get done, I will have chapters 13, 14, and 16 to go. And I know that 13, I believe, is another way to create Java interfaces with FX. Nope, 13 is applets. 14, I believe, is on FX components, which I've never used, but I'll still try to lecture on it as best I can. And 16 is on databases. All right. So after we get done, we now have 4 chapters to go, 13, 14, 15, and 16. I'll quickly do chapter 15, after which, as mentioned, we will have 4. Well, after this chapter, we'll have 4 to go. Okay, so I'll be back with those shortly.